So this topic is nature as an integration tool for psychedelic experiences, and I kind of there's a lot to say. Well, first of all, I want to suggest, like for me, the way I look at psychedelics, more so the plants than the actual laboratory compounds, but I look at them as a food group, as a nutrient that, in the same way that the superfoods that you might eat that have aminos and proteins and adaptogenic kind of compounds in them that are quite slightly more evolved in their capacity to like read your nervous system and know whether it needs to be stimulated or depressed in some way. I feel like the entheogenic plants have developed these alkaloids and compounds that are quite. It's like if they're the superfoods, and these are the X-Men mutant foods, not mutant. let's just go with X-Men foods that have these really evolved, complex alkaloids and compounds that interact with our nervous system in ways that we don't really know, because there's a lot of laws that are preventing the research kind of to be done with these things. But what we do know is they make a lot of connections in the brain. And so I feel like the reason, like most indigenous cultures, except for the tribe up in the Inuits, like they didn't have access to psychedelic plants, and so they would get into altered states via drumming. But these plant compounds, they literally make connections in the brain. And when your brains and nervous system's connected, it also like usually inhibits blood flow to particular areas that dilute the richness of reality that we could potentially be perceiving, because it'd just be like overwhelming. And so blood flow tends to like be restricted to those areas, but then connections are made throughout the internal networks. And so when we're feeling connected in our brain, we tend to feel connected to our environment. So I feel like the fact that these substances have been illegal and aren't interacted with as a nutrient, as a food group that should be there as a complete part of a balanced diet of being a human being connected to reality and your ecosystem. Now I'm gonna probably not the next one, but yeah, the next one will probably be about the topic on the dangers and dark side of psychedelics, just because I don't want to be painting this picture that they're all kind of like love and light, because there are some real kind of pitfalls in this culture and community and these substances. Sorry, the battery just went dead. So nature as an integration tool, and I just kind of like wanted to kind of frame that's how I feel like a lot of the indigenous tribes would interact with, or just looked at these psychedelic substances, and that's how I look at them, as a nutrient in the food group. But back to the nature as an integration tool. Nature is the kind of ultimate psychedelic. Like immersion in nature, like deep immersion, is a profoundly psychedelic experience, whether it's the wilderness of the forests and the mountains and the deserts, or the ocean. But because I used to teach flow states and integration of altered experiences, and what I came to understand was that micro flow experiences integrate macro flow experiences. And so microdosing in nature, which is what you're doing, especially like when I go for a run, as well as like playing with my sense of focus and zooming in and out, it's like I'm constantly touching trees and I'm constantly touching leaves and just basically getting microdosed of the tiny little microorganisms that are kind of like bleeding into my skin. And I feel like that's why most people are ill and diseases, because they don't have the diversity in their microbiome, which is part of the skin. So microdosing in nature. But So yeah, I recently did, as a way of recovering from a failed experiment. On the topic of experiments, the dark goggles. Like, I didn't get any sleep at all the next night. Like, my circadian rhythms were fucked, and it, like, I mean, I've had worse things happen than just having my circadian rhythms fucked. But yeah. It's just some of the collateral damage that happens when I kind of put my body and psyche into certain altered states. So, in one of like 6 months ago, 5 months ago, as a way of recovering from another previous experience that I'll probably do a separate video on, what happened? I was sitting on the beach, quite broken, in the sense of like, I really fucked up, and I understood this like micro flow. Like, I felt like I needed to do like little things to get back into it, and confronting or interacting with my fears is the best way to get into like these little micro flow systems. And I'm looking at the ocean, and I realize that I'm like actually afraid of. I've always been afraid of the ocean. Like, it's a fear not in a humbling way of respect, but of like actual, I feel incompetent in that. Even though I was a state swimmer as a kid, I felt like whenever I would go into the ocean, I wouldn't venture any further away from the shore where I could actually touch the floor with my feet. And so it was a combination of like my incompetence and the overwhelming or the whelming kind of power of it. And so I was like, I got to deal with this, because one of the things that I like to do is or have done is like use my fears as a compass. And when I do that, it almost like opens up an entirely new ecosystem to explore in life. And so I have many ecosystems that I've approached purely because I had a tension and an anxiety and a fear around it, and I was like, well, I got to explore that. I got to understand why. What is that? And they've in most cases have at least provided really good stories, but like just yeah, they've opened up just a spectrum of life that was almost like a closed door previously. So I did this, and I was like, what about I'm afraid of the ocean. I'm going to do this 3-day watermanship course, which was basically a freediving course that initially when I used to teach flow states and integration of altered states, one of the like larger plans that I had was like learning how to to develop a relationship with each element. With air, I did a skydiving course and jumped out of a plane for the first time without doing tandem. And then my theory was like, oh, and I'll do like freediving and whatever to get into to water, and then rock climbing and just mountaineering for earth. And then I was like tantra and sex or salsa was fire. But this was like an idea that I had a few years ago. Pardon me. And anyway, I did this, and it was a 3-day course, and that ended out at Julian Rocks, which is considered to be the most kind of like the birthplace of the Dreamtime for the indigenous around here. It's the most eastern point of Australia, and the Dreamtime for them kind of like begins on the east coast and travels around the globe. And geologically, it's 300 million years older than any other rock around Australia or of Australia, and so I think that's pretty cool. But went out there and did a 15-meter depth dive, and when I kind of came out, I was like, it reminded me of a conversation that I had with a carer and guardian of mine when I was 14, when I was leaving him, and he was like, what do you want to do when you grow up? And I'm like, dude, that's like a lot of pressure to put on a 13-year-old. I'm like, I don't know. I'm not one of those kids that knows. And but he was like, just what? And I was like, my answer was to be a great white shark cave diving instructor. And not to say that you need to do, if you want to be a fireman, that you need to be a fireman when you grow up. But it felt like a thing that I wanted to do, that where I wasn't, even though there was an element of service in there, like education and getting people to understand these magical creatures, but it wasn't like I want to change the world, or that I'm like needing to be validated or just kind of that I was reacting to like the therapeutic culture that I was so immersed in. And so it felt like a place of innocence and purity. And so I'm kind of slightly entertaining that. But what I came to look at afterwards, I was looking at the ocean as the psychedelic of psychedelics in the way that people interact with it as well. It's like in the same way that psychedelics, the poison's in the dosage, in the sense that it will, the same compound will completely change its behavior depending on the amount, the dosage. And so in the same way that people interact with the ocean, in the same way, like some people, it's like the British people, they just get their feet wet. Some people don't even get their feet wet, they just like sit on the beach and sunbake, and there's no judgment, that's all cool. But then some people will kind of like body surf, and then some people will actually surf, and then some people will kind of go snorkeling and scuba diving and then being towed onto big waves, and then being dumped out at sea, and it's like they're all the different spectrums of interacting with that ecosystem, and that they all achieve different things, and they all need various types of training. So it's like if you're going to go out, just for surfing as an example, you wouldn't just like before you hopped out on a board, you would practice the techniques and the skills on land and get familiar, the muscle memory familiar with that, before you're actually having to deal with the complicated kind of navigation of a wobbly kind of board, of a wobbly wave. And I feel like in a way I'm going to probably do a talk on some of the ways to prepare for psychedelic states and being dumped, because part of the training was actually being like a simulated wipeout, where you're having to like not just practice your pranayama yoga breathing, but actually kind of performance breathing, where you're just staying relaxed. And it felt like, wow, this training is if I had learned this training before I went to Peru, or was like when I was in Peru, it was like the ideal type of training to navigate ayahuasca ceremonies and peak kind of overdoses of psychedelic experiences, and even micro experiences. So I'm now kind of training up as a freediving instructor as a way to kind of like practically get people back into the environment, but as a way of like, once they've had these like peak psychedelic experiences, as a way of integrating. And so, okay, so where am I going with this? So why does nature act as a integration tool? Because it's like it's immersive, like especially the ocean is like you get in there and you submerge yourself underwater, and you're having to like it's cultivating presence and awareness of your internal physical body, but then also your kind of relational sense. But the atmosphere changes, and you're dealing with like pressure in the way that pressure can happen in the psychedelic space, and it's like rich in colors, and there's little fucking creatures. There's like aliens and beings that are fucking like aliens. That's okay, but why is it an integration tool? Because it's like when we have a psychedelic experience, you go from like perceiving the 50% or the 2,000 bits of data per second that our nervous system's processing of a potential, I think it's like 400 billion bits of data that they say, science is now saying, but the figure continues to grow, and I feel like it'll continue to grow. But it's like when you take something and it might just last 12 hours or 8 hours or 4 hours, but it's like it's in the system for weeks and months. And so you might have this like peak opening, but then there's still a level of sensitivity and enhanced awareness in that space. So immersing yourself in nature after psychedelic experiences, not only does it like amalgamate the fluctuating data that's sitting in the bioenergetic field, in your bioenergetic field, and it amalgamates it from data into information, into functional patterns and wisdom, but it's also beautiful. Aesthetically, it's beautiful. So you just focusing on something that is organically beautiful is going to entrain your nervous system to organize itself in a beautiful way too. So it's simple. It's complex. Nature's complex, and so it's like when you're overwhelmed with life, just focus on the beauty of nature and insights will happen and simplicity will arise. And it's like so there's that reason. There's also there's something else in that of like when you open yourself up to this spectrum of reality. So our senses and our five, they only perceive we're only perceiving 1% of the spectrum of light and 1% of the acoustic spectrum. And then when you take these substances, it opens them up. The figures vary, but it's like 40 to 50. And when you have like a non-dual experience, you might be dealing with the entire electromagnetic spectrum. And so kind of coming back from that is you want to be really gentle, and you're also going to be more sensitive to your surroundings. So if you're like inside and watching TV and in these like inorganic structures that collapse the fractal harmonic wavelength of a particular atmosphere, did that make sense? Like I'll provide a link to that so that's a bit more relevant. But like when you're in a organic field, the little waves fit into the big waves, so there's like fractal compression, which just feels good. And when you're in an inorganic atmosphere that is like made of inorganic material and isn't proportioned according to golden mean and sacred geometry, it's or the Fibonacci ratio, it creates like basically the little waves collapse one another, and so it just doesn't feel nice. So nature, the harmonics of nature almost like allow the nervous system to just consolidate everything that's just floating around. There was something else that I was going to say regarding that. Blah, 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 blah. Being in nature just promotes movement. And so movement is an integration tool. And it doesn't have to be kind of really complex movements, just walking, just gentle walking. But like the beautiful thing about swimming is it's like this full kind of three-dimensional immersion that's usually spiraling. And so it's the spirals of the body that kind of like create, it does a lot of things. I think that's the separate talk that I want to go into, but just being in nature promotes movement, and then movement also, movement then integrates psychedelic experiences. So I think that's about it. Can I like go into anything else? Maybe also the Schumann Resonance. So the Schumann Resonance is a frequency that the Earth emits, which used to be at 7.34 hertz, which was the hertz of the theta state. But just recently on the 28th of January, it jumped up into a gamma range, which is the state, the frequency of unity consciousness, and like it just makes more connections in the brain. And so basically allowing your feet to feel connected to the earth, and then but sitting in it and immersing in that will kind of re-entrain the brain and nervous system to get into a state that will amalgamate peak kind of macro flow psychedelic experiences. I think that's enough. That was now 20 minutes, but that's those that are interested will listen to that. Bye.